Have you ever experienced something, witnessed something, seen something where you're like, why am I alone right now? That's how I felt reading this, where I was reading, I'm like, what the heck am I reading? Today's video is gonna be, I suppose, a review. It's more of a book chat about How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. This is my first Grady Hendrix book, and I gotta say, I really wasn't expecting the book to be the way it is. I thought it would be the way it is to some degree. I'm gonna structure this not quite how I typically structure my reviews. Typically when I do a review, I am a little more specific. I'll talk about things like the pacing, the writing style, so on and so on. Today it's gonna be more of like a general non-spoiler synopsis and then an actual synopsis, because the marketing, I feel like, portrays this book in a way that is not accurate. And then we'll just chat through the book, and I really am looking forward to letting you know about some of the stuff in this book. So the general synopsis is that you have these two siblings, Mark and Louise, and you're primarily following Louise, and she is a single mom. She loves her daughter, Poppy, who's 5. Her parents have died. Both her parents have died in a car accident. She has to suddenly find herself taking on, what are you going to do about the will, probate, their house, all of their possessions. She's got to fly back to where they live. She's got all of these things suddenly burdening her. And she's also trying to accept the fact that her parents are gone. I actually felt like the opening of the book did a really good job of capturing that initial shock, the grief, the I don't know how to process this. And there's a part at the beginning where when she's going to the airport and she's, fumbling with her bags or trying to find her ticket or things like that, where she just feels the need to apologize and be like, oh, I'm sorry, my parents just died. I'm sorry, my parents just died. And that I thought was incredibly realistic, and I was really hooked by the beginning. I would say the first 30 to maybe 40% of the book I really was enjoying. It's everything that transpired after that. I knew going in that this was a horror story. At the very least, it was like a mix of horror and maybe a little bit satire. And you find that when Louise gets home and she has to spend time with her really frustrating brother, who she doesn't have a very good relationship with, the two of them have to try to sell their parents' house. They're trying to even agree on what they're going to do with the house, what they're going to do with the possessions. There's all this familial drama, all these feelings that come to the surface as a result of this traumatic event. The house, some odd things are happening. When Louise is going through the stuff, when she walks into the house, she's looking around, she's noticing some very disturbing things. And when they decide they want to potentially sell the house and they have somebody they know look through it, they're told, this house is haunted. I'm not going to sell it until you get this taken care of. Siblings, Louise is like, this is absurd. This is not true. The house isn't haunted. And the brother's like, oh, well, if mom and dad are still around. And it's just showing the differences between these characters, the drama of it all, and you kind of really root for Louise because you're like, oh man, I would be in that position too. I'd be like, the house is not haunted. So that's the general synopsis. From there, you are discovering what about the house is potentially or not dangerous and haunted. If you only want to know that brief synopsis, then I would say maybe don't keep watching. Because you might be the sort of person that you don't want to have any indication or clue as to, is the paranormal real? Is it not? Is it all in the person's head? Are they a reliable narrator? Is it commentary on grief and how it affects the mind? If you don't want to know anything else, then don't keep watching. I'm not even in spoiler territory yet. I just want to get into a more accurate description of what this book actually is. So I say actual because I think that it was a little misleading to market this as a haunted house book. This book is actually more... It's not so much that the house is haunted. It's that there is a puppet in the house that has sentience, we'll say, and can move around and is somewhat alive. So it's more like a haunted puppet story, and the puppet is in the house. That's really more of what it comes down to. And it would seem the puppet has magical abilities that can kind of affect other things in the house, other created things, other forms of art, like the other puppets in the house, or this taxidermied nativity scene of squirrels, that kind of stuff. All is rooted in this puppet though. So it's less the house and it's more of this puppet. And you are exploring the background of the family and the mom, and even their family history and how that all plays a role in everything that's transpiring. You're trying to piece together what's even going on. And also, if you are somebody who is genuinely disturbed by the idea of a puppet come to life, then this might actually be kind of creepy for you. From here, I'm going to start just chatting through thoughts on the book, the progression of the book, because, oh my gosh, some of these scenes, I really was like, what is going on? The puppet. So I will say that I find thus far in reading some fantasy horror, some horror, gothic horror, I really like the setup. I really like that feeling of being disturbed and like the creepy little things that build. I don't care as much about what happens at the end. I care more about how I feel leading up to it, because oftentimes the end, everything explodes. There's this enormous, big, momentous event at the end. And I don't really care as much about that stuff, because usually I just want that, like, the person notices, I could have sworn that I had put that there. I don't know why it's over here today. Something must have happened. I don't know. My brother must have moved it. All those little things where you as the reader, you're like, oh, no, like there's something else going on. And when you just slowly start to see the person really questioning, I love that buildup. And in this, I was enjoying some of the buildup. So an example, early on, when Louise comes back to her parents' house, she notices that the TV is on. And the puppet, whose name is Pupkin, which we'll get to that name later, Pupkin is like seated in the dad's chair, and it looks like the puppet is watching the TV. And our main character is like, Mom's so weird. She always treats them like they're actually real people. And so she turns the TV off, and she just gets settled in or whatever. And then a little while later, the TV turns back on. And she's like, oh, that's weird. And then she figures it must be on some kind of timer. And because Mom and Dad, they left in such a hurry, you know, maybe they didn't turn the timer off or whatever. So she's trying to think through things rationally. And I do feel like that alone was actually genuinely creepy. She unplugs the TV. Later, she comes back to the house and she sees the TV on again. And she sees it from outside and she thinks somebody must have broken into our house, because the only explanation is that someone broke in and, I don't know, plugged the TV back in. And, you know, so she's trying to figure out, like, what is going on? I like all of those things. One of my, I guess, criticisms of the way that this book played out, and this is just a personal opinion, is I felt like those little things pretty quickly just stopped and we were full on like, the puppet, it's the puppet. We had some really absurd backstory with the brother and the puppet's like attacking her. And this is maybe halfway through the book. So I'm like, where are we going from here? It's no longer that really creepy setup. It's just, all right, it's the puppet. I guess we're going to try to figure out how to kill this puppet. And the puppet is kind of annoying. I didn't really find the puppet creepy or scary. I just found them really obnoxious because they're always like, wee, yay, Pupkin feel this way, Pupkin don't like this. So the backstory, I couldn't believe, I'm like, wait a second, what? I feel like you would be on high alert about this stupid puppet if you had this backstory. So the whole book up to this point, the brother seems like such a loser, and the main character Louise has continuously been thinking like he dropped out of college after begging our parents to let him go. I had to pay my way through. I had to get a scholarship. I had to work really hard. And my brother, he just begged our parents and they finally gave in and they paid for him to go to this really nice school, and then he immediately dropped out. And so she has these kind of negative feelings about her brother, like, ugh, he's such a loser. He always got whatever he wanted. He never tried. He never cared. And she gets attacked by the puppet Pupkin when she's trying to convince her brother the house is not haunted. She's like, I'll stay in the house. There's nothing to be afraid of. So she's staying in the house, and the puppet starts attacking her, and it is so gross. I have to say, as somebody with an eye phobia, what the puppet does to her eye is just so gross, and I hesitate to tell you because I know how disturbed I get. I'll have a timestamp because even reading it, I was like, no. So he like sticks a needle in her eye, and that's so gross. And she's like, and she's flipping out. Brother, he just had a feeling that something wasn't right, and so he had stayed, and when he heard all the noise, he comes back, he shoots the puppet, which is kind of funny to me. She's like, take me to the emergency room, because her eye's all, because he like put a needle in her eye. Her brother's like, I know what you need. And he takes her to a diner. That's not gonna fix it, because he's like, how many fingers am I holding up? However many he holds up. And she says the right amount. He's like, see, you're fine. And I'm like, no, she's not fine. He seems like pretty calm about all this. And she kind of thinks like, I must be hallucinating. I gotta check myself in. And he's like, you're not hallucinating. It's not all in your mind. It's real, okay? It's real. And I'm gonna finally tell you what happened that semester that I dropped out of college. And then you get this backstory. You're now on the brother's perspective, and you get this backstory. And it is so bizarre. He kind of makes friends with this group of people that are very anti-war, which, okay. And they're really into puppets. He introduces them to his mom's puppet, Pupkin. He's like, this is my mom's puppet, Pupkin. And they're like, we should all be like Pupkin. And they're very odd. And they get a gig at an elementary school. And at first they're normal and they're like putting on a puppet show for the kids. And then it turns into a very aggressive anti-war message for these little kids where they're like, people are gonna die, they're gonna be shot and killed, and they're like really grotesque with their descriptions and stuff, and the teacher is refusing to pay them for the gig because she's saying you traumatize these children. A lot of these children have family that are at war right now and stuff, and they're like, whatever, the system's and okay, fine, like we're establishing this group, okay. Get really invested in Pupkin and like puppets and like wearing Pupkin, and the main character at this point, Mark, the one whose perspective you're from, the brother, he's very hazy, kind of nothing feels real doesn't feel real anymore, only Pupkin feels real, basically, like when they wear the puppet and stuff like that. And he talks about waking up in a haze, and I think he says he had blood and even number 2 on himself, and I'm like, what? I feel like, okay, that's really bizarre. In my head at this point, because I stopped at some point because my husband Sean came home from work and I was telling him about this book, and I'm like, I kind of liked the beginning, but I don't know, this whole new section is very odd to me because it sort of goes against everything before. If he's like, I think the house might be haunted, I don't know, what if it's mom and dad? And I'm like, sounds like you knew it was the puppet. I'm confused. Did you not know that the puppet was back at your mom and dad's house? Is that, because that's the only explanation. Otherwise, shouldn't you already know that it's the puppet, sorry. I'm like, maybe he doesn't know. Maybe he never realized that his mom somehow got the puppet back and brought it back to the house. He never knew. And he thought this whole semester. What ends up happening is he basically burns down his friend's parents' house, I believe was the person. And his friends were inside and he just ran, and he like could never bring it upon himself to find out if his friends died in that fire and stuff. I'm like, okay. So at one point he goes to the friend whose parents' house that he burned down, and he's like, hey, can I get my mom's puppet back? And I'm like, okay, so you definitely know that you got the puppet back, because the guy just gives him the puppet. I'm like, okay, so you knew. I'm confused. If you already knew that this puppet was having these effects on the mind and everything, and that it was there was maybe a little more to Pupkin than meets the eye, then why wouldn't you think to address it? Because he literally at one point he goes to the bathroom and some of the puppets are arranged in the bathroom. He comes out and he's like yelling at his sister Louise. He's like, why would you do this? Why did you do that? And she's like, I didn't do that, Mark. What are you talking about? You're just in your head because of the house is haunted thing. I'm like, he should know. He should know. But maybe he just decided, I don't know, that he was high or something. But basically he must have rationalized it all away. Okay, fine. I still think at this point he should have kind of known about the puppet, maybe warned his sister, maybe thought when someone was telling him the house is haunted, he should have been like, I bet it's that puppet. Fine, that's not what happened. So we go back to modern day, the diner. They're like, we gotta kill Pupkin. That's what they decide, like, let's go. And they go back to the house, and I truly couldn't believe that this next part happened the way it happened. So with it, like, no foreshadowing. I really want to emphasize this was not really built up. This wasn't a thing that we mentioned earlier, really. So in this really what feels like end of the book level climactic moment where they're like, let's go get Pumpkin. They're there and the puppet's like, wee, hey, put me on, you know, like being annoying. Then Mark all of a sudden is like, no, stop. And Louise is like, Mark, like, what are you doing? Come on, snap out of it. And he's like, no, Louise, you have to get out of here. She's like, Mark, I'm not leaving you alone, you know, whatever. And then he's like, no, you don't understand. It's Spider. And I'm like, what is Spider? And then you get a flashback. When I say I couldn't believe this transpired this way is because this to me was the equivalent of in a fantasy book when there's all of a sudden a spell that fixes all the problems, and that spell has never been talked about, hinted at, alluded to, foreshadowed, nothing. It's just something happens and they're like, spell, and it like fixes the problem, or the bad guy suddenly has, just whatever. You get what I'm talking about because a lot of you are fantasy fans. So he's like, it's Spider. And then you go and get a flashback, another one, and they're kids and they're talking about like, Dad, we want a dog. Mom, we want a dog. We really want a dog. And the dad's like, no kids, no dog. I'm going to be the one that takes care of it because at some point you're going to not take care of it. They're like, we want a dog. And so they were obsessed with wanting a dog. They would watch so many movies that had dogs in it to a point where the dad's like, one dog movie a week. Because their mom is so artsy and eccentric with her puppets and being somebody who loves to tell stories, the brother's like, I know, I'll have a dog and I don't need my parents' permission. I'll take care of it. His name is Spider. And he basically creates an imaginary dog. And him and Louise are like, we love Spider. We love Spider. And they have this imaginary dog. Okay, you get this flashback letting you know all of this information so that we can go back to this climactic moment that we just interrupt to say, for Mark to be like, you don't understand, Louise. Spider, he's here. This imaginary dog comes to life and starts attacking and like clawing at and biting and shredding apart Louise. And I'm like, what? What? No. I was flabbergasted, to say the least.
White people love being flabbergasted.
Eventually, Pumpkin, you find out, was in Mark's head talking to Mark and saying, I'll let her live. I won't let Spider kill her. Put me on. And so Mark puts Pumpkin on. And once that happens, he like can't control his body and he gets a hammer and he starts beating his sister with this hammer. And it's getting so aggressively violent. And I'm like, what? And then so he's like, please, Louise, run, stop, you know, whatever. So she manages to get the hammer away from him. And he's like, get it off, do anything, get it off. Like get Pumpkin off his arm. So she goes for, that's right, a saw. It's a power saw. And there's a part of him like, you really can't just pull it off of his arm? It's a puppet. She holds her brother down because she got on top of him and she saws off his arm. That happens. He's obviously in agony and she hurriedly calls the police. And I feel like the excuse she gives to everybody, like family, the paramedics, I should say she called the, paramedics, not really police. But she tells them, like, Mark drank a little bit this morning and he, like, cut his arm off. Hey, I know you don't really think highly of your brother, but way to make him seem, because the rest of the family already kind of is like, Mark he never fulfills his potential. They kind of speak negatively of this guy. So I'm like, that's kind of mean. And so she adds in, because she's all cut up, she's like, I will say I kind of distracted him because some shelves fell on me and then like that alerted him and then he accidentally cut off his arm. And I get it. What are you supposed to say? Like, this puppet possessed him and then it was beating me. In order to save myself, I had to cut off his arm. What are you supposed to say? So I get it, but also I'm like, that kind of sucks for that guy. He not only got his arm cut off, but then everybody thinks it was his own fault because he's an idiot. That sucks. But anyway, so he's in the hospital, he's recovering. This next part. So I did feel like the arguments between the characters, the brother and sister at the beginning, felt fairly realistic. It felt like there is just something about certain family members that as soon as you're together, they just have a way of saying the smallest of things, but it's so irritating. It gets under your skin and you just like instantly are like, ugh, this, and it's immediate. And I felt like that was done realistically earlier, but this next part, even I was like, really? So I had to tab it because it made me laugh. It shouldn't have made me laugh, but it made me laugh. The brother comes to, he's on drugs, a lot of drugs, because he's obviously in incredible pain. He just had his arm sawed off. And after her wounds are tended to, she goes to visit her brother. And he kind of is like being really rude to her. And I will say, to be clear, he was telling her like, do it, do anything, take it, get it off, And then basically like do it when she had the saw. So it seemed like he was like, yeah, please, I don't want to beat my sister to death. And so that was, her solution was to cut it off. But she asks him because he seems very like mad at her. She's like, are you blaming me? And he says an apology would go a long way. For what? And then I'm like, okay, I mean, I think it's fair to at least be like, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to have to do that. I didn't know what else to do. That's fair. But for her to be like, for what? When she's going to visit him when his arm is cut off, And then, so he says they can't reattach it. And she said, you told me to. And he says, I thought they could reattach it. How could you even do that? I couldn't do it to you. And I'm like, hey, that's a little unfair. You were literally beating her with a hammer. And your weird imaginary dog thing was coming to life because of this puppet that you put on your arm. And like all this, I'm just like, okay, both of you are being absolutely unbelievably stupid right now. I feel like I get him being like, you could apologize. I kind of get that. But also for him to be like, well, I wouldn't have done it to you. She says, you were trying to kill me with a hammer. And then he said, you tried to drown me at the Calvins. Because there's this whole thing about when she was 5 and he was 2, he fell through the ice. And then she just walked away because Pupkin told her to. But she repressed that memory and everybody pretends that it didn't happen. But he remembers it. And everybody is like, that's not what happened. You just fell. I didn't know, whatever. So that's what he's alluding to. And she said, we agreed that was Pupkin. So Pupkin's the one who tried to kill you with the hammer, but you sawed off my arm. And then she's like, can you keep it down? I had to lie about what happened to a lot of people. Yeah, because if they knew what you did, you'd be charged with assault. I'm like, what is this conversation? Are you seriously upset with me because I saved your life? Or is this some post-surgical dysfunction because you're pumped up on meds? Anyway, so then the doctor comes in and they have a chat with the doctor, and the doctor tells her, like, you're going to have to milk his wound, like, here's what you're going to have to do to take care of him. So after the doctor leaves, she, trying to lighten the mood, make a joke, she said, I have to milk your wound. I think I'm being punished enough. And I get that she's trying to make a joke and it doesn't land well. But I don't think this was supposed to be funny, but I did laugh out loud. He replied, it's not funny, sorry. He said, I have one arm, Louise. The whole exchange was really amusing to me. I really want to make clear, like, all that stuff happened in the 200s, and this book is over 400 pages. So when I say that all of the what felt like climactic moments happened really early on, I'm like, what's left? That's kind of what I was referring to. But after, because she goes back, she lights him up, and she's like, I've done it. I've dealt with Pupkin. Then she flies back home, and she discovers that her little daughter has, with her father's mother, so the grandma that didn't just pass away, she has created a puppet with her grandma, and it's Pupkin. And so Pupkin's back, and now it's attached to her daughter, and her daughter will not take it off, and the dad is like, oh, it reminds her of her grandma who just died, and, she just found out about death and all these horrible things. She's attached to this puppet. It's fine. But Louise, when she comes home and she sees Pupkin on her daughter's hand, flips out. And when I say flips out, I mean she urinates all over herself. And then she basically attacks her daughter, trying to rip off Pupkin from the daughter. And the daughter's like screaming, and it's like, ow, and it's sad. It's really sad. And then the dad of the daughter, who's been watching her while Louise was back home, he's like pulling Louise off her, like, what is wrong with you? What are you doing? And, and he sees she's wet herself and stuff, and he's like, what the heck? She seems, obviously, from the father's point of view, like she's in need of help. Talking to her after the daughter has, I think, gone to bed, and he's like, what happened back there? And she's like, I'm just really, traumatized. My brother had a doll like that, and it just like brings up a lot of memories, and I think, just the grief of everything and the stress and the little sleep and, all this stuff. And he's like, oh, I understand. But he's like a little nervous too, like, do I leave you alone with our daughter? This doesn't seem right. But he's talking to her, and he keeps like consoling her, like, I'll stay if you want. And she's like, no, it's fine. Because she really wants to get Pupkin off her daughter's arm. And she's like, I need him to leave so I can take care of this. And then he's like, maybe being a little too consoling. And he's like, really, I can stay if you want. She realizes, like, oh no, this is his, like, I want to do it voice. And I'm like, hey man, I'm not saying that if your partner wets themselves that you can never be attracted to them in that fashion ever again, because, like, I don't know, stuff happens. But wetting yourself and attacking your very small child, why on earth very shortly after would you be like, but also, do you want to like do it? I'm like, no, what is this? What is this? It felt like a way to make it like, isn't the dad such a loser? Because also right around that same time when he goes to actually leave, because she's finally like, no, I'm fine. And then he's like, okay, well, we'll take things slow. And she's just like, ugh, to herself. And then he tells her, like, by the way, I got you a lot of soup and it's frozen and, you know, if you need soup. And she's like, thanks. And then it says, like, I hate soup or whatever. And I'm like, okay, I guess Ian is, I think that was his name. I'm like, I guess Ian's just, like, the worst. But also, I will say, it is kind of not cool that he immediately wanted to sleep with the mother of his child who just attacked his child. And, like, yeah, I'm like, all right. The daughter refuses to take Pupkin off her arm. Louise realizes, I gotta fly her back home and I gotta visit some of my good old Southern religious family members who will figure out what to do about this. So they get back to where she's from and they're like, this is a demon. I'll tell you what.
That's a clean burning hell, I tell you what.
And I'm doing that accent because that's kind of the narrator did this like stereotypical. I'm not saying it's wrong to have that accent because some people in America have that accent. But coupled with the dialogue that they gave them, I was like, hey, Barb is the lady's name. She's trying to assure them like, this is going to go real well. I promise we're going to take care of this. I'll tell you what. She says, we're going to take this curse and pop it like a pimple. It'll be easy peasy, slick and greasy. Like, first off, gross. Second, I've never heard that phrase. If you live in the South, have you heard that phrase? I've never heard that phrase. And then also, maybe a little bit not serious enough given the circumstances. At this point, the daughter is basically possessed. She just like is out of it and it's all Pupkin. And I feel like this is a little, it's just not taking this very seriously to be like, oh, it'll be fine. We'll pop it like a pimple and it'll be greasy. So they're like, all right, let's go. And this chapter, right before they're trying to perform what is basically this exorcism, this chapter ends with, then let's rock and roll. But first, I've got a bladder full of passion fruit lemonade that needs a download. And I warn y'all, the walls in here are real thin. You might want to go outside. I don't like going to the bathroom where I feel like other people can hear me, but I'm like, we're about to do an exorcism. Why are we talking like this? I guess she's just real confident that this isn't a big deal whatsoever. So they try to perform basically, like I said, what is an exorcism? She's like, tell me her name. And she keeps like demanding that the puppet tells her his real name, and she keeps shouting out various names of demons, like, is it you? Is it you? And then fill in the blank demon name. And then he's like, I Pupkin, I Mark, I Louise. And that's how, I swear that's how it talks. I'm not just doing that voice. There was another line where they're like, you know, they're praying and everything. And she said, this will be strenuous. The enemy will try to crush our spirits by conjuring extraordinary manifestations that will make each of you wish you had never been born. Be strong, trust in the Lord, and stay hydrated. You know those like stores you pass in the mall and they're like custom t-shirts and it'll be like, instead of Bath and Body Works, it'll be like Back and Body Hurts and things like that. And then there's also always some kind of like really extreme political, like, if this offends you, then, you know, stay away or whatever. And it's like somebody holding guns or something, whatever, right? Those really extreme, random, silly custom t-shirt stores. This reminded me of that, where couldn't you just see a t-shirt that says, be strong, trust in the Lord, stay hydrated? So that made me laugh. They try to perform the exorcism. Turns out it's not a demon, it's a ghost. Pupkin is their uncle who died when he was 5, and he has unfinished business. And he apparently attached himself to this puppet, and then their mom had this puppet, and it just got very jealous of anybody who took up the mom's attention and all these things. Now that the mom is dead, it can't accept that what is its sister, their mom who just died, it like can't accept that she's gone. It can't accept, it's out of touch with reality and all these things. It's like actually kind of sad where you're like, this spirit of this 5-year-old boy who died in this accident, it's almost like it tries to recreate the same accident that happened to it. So that's explaining why Louise sort of just let her brother fall through the ice and didn't really try to help him and all these things. And you're like, I mean, that's kind of sad. But at this point, I was kind of not that invested. The next chapter starts where the religious Southern women are arguing about ghosts and demons, and, you know, one of them's like, no, ghosts don't exist, and she, like, quotes scripture. She says, there's no such thing as ghosts. They're all different aspects of the enemy. And then another one says, does it really matter? And then Barb, the bladder lady, is like, it's a whole different ballgame. There's no demon named Freddy, because Freddy is the name of their uncle who died. So they had found out his name was Freddy. So she says there's no demon named Freddy. And Mark goes, Freddy Krueger? They go back to their house. They find Freddy, their parents' house. They find Freddy was buried in the backyard. So then they find him. They're like, you need to move on. Please move on, Freddy. And then he does. Mark fixes up the house because it's kind of like poetic because he's also fixing himself up. Fixes up the house and then they sell it and it sells for a lot of money. And then they split the profit 50-50, siblings being nice and fair to each other. So now Louise has a lot of money, a little bit of savings for her daughter. And whenever Louise is kind of thinking about grief and missing her parents and certain events in life that are just tough, she calls her brother. And that's the end of the book. I mean, the end was fine. That's fine. Overall, thoughts. I think what confused me about this book is for me personally, it didn't do enough of certain things for me to feel like it worked. What I mean by that is, obviously, there are those movies that are pure satire and they mock horror films. So something like Scary Movie. The whole thing is really ridiculous, really absurd, really over the top. Everybody's a caricature. Everybody's really stupid. Everything that happens is dumb. The scary stuff isn't scary at all. So there's those sorts of satire. Then you have things that it feels as though they are paying respect to the genre while simultaneously critiquing it and maybe doing a parody of it. And while this is not a horror example, the book Sword Defiant, in my opinion, is sort of analyzing the typical fantasy hero's quest, and it's zeroing in on that, and it's paying its respects to it, but it's also criticizing it because it's like, what about the mental toll that takes on a person? And really analyzing the after, and honestly, like the PTSD that comes along with that, and that sense of, what do I do with my life now? And I really liked that about Sword Defiant. So I feel like this book was kind of trying to fall into that camp. But I think because the beginning was set up to feel honestly so realistic, to pull from a lot of very real life experiences, and then to just all of a sudden become such silly nonsense, I don't know how to feel, because I think it was all intentional. I think it was meant to be absolutely ridiculous. I think it's to a point where I'm like, I don't even feel like it was supposed to be scary, but I also don't like that really, really disturbing, really extreme violence that comes just all of a sudden. I'm not a fan of that. And I think because it was like somewhat serious and realistic and then became really absurd and quirky and out there, that the juxtaposition between the two didn't quite work for me. I think if it had kind of been hinted at all along, and I guess you could argue some of the arguments that we have between the siblings. Some of them were a little on the ridiculous side, but honestly, nothing comes close to the, like, now I got a whole lot of lemonade in my bladder, like right before you're about to perform an exorcism, and then all those things, you know. So I am curious if you have read Grady Hendrix. I think a lot of them are meant to be parody-like, but maybe not full-on satire parody and just kind of somewhat in the middle. Let me know if you have read a lot of Grady Hendrix works. Do they always tend to be like this, or is it sort of it's not quite like, I don't know, because he's written a lot of things and I've heard similar elements to what I'm discussing. I've heard it here and there, but yeah, this is my first Grady Hendrix and I don't know. I weirdly, if they're all like this, then I'm like, I could see that being kind of entertaining. I mean, I was entertained, obviously, but in a kind of like, what the heck is this kind of a way. So yeah, that was How to Sell a Haunted House. Let me know if you've read it, your thoughts. I wanted to read a couple of negative reviews because they made me laugh. I didn't want to forget, because after I read it, I was like, what do other people think of this? So a couple of the negative reviews were quite funny. Somebody said, Pumpkin is the most annoying name to have to read over and over again. By the way, when I said we'll get back to Pumpkin's name later, if you couldn't tell, I think Pumpkin is literally supposed to be foreshadowing the fact that it's a puppet and it's their kin, because you find out it's the uncle. Maybe it's not. I don't know. Or it's supposed to be like pumpkin, but said in like a southern way where it's like pumpkin, you know, I don't know. And then this one also, this user's name is Edgar Allan Ho, says, it's a puppet? Just kick it. Which is kind of how I felt too. And then I also liked Jessica's review. It says, was this book supposed to be so stupid? And then she says, am I missing something? I'd be happy to never read the term puppet hole for the rest of my life. So anyway, I thought I'd share those to wrap the video up. Let me know your thoughts if you've read this, if you haven't read it. I hope this was entertaining for you, and maybe you'll end up picking it up and you'll have a really good time with it. But thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.